back to the Real Talk podcast. I'm your host today, Lucas Holflower, and on today's show, I am joined by two gentlemen from ARPA Canada. That is the Association for Reform Political Action. Many of you will know and love them dearly, and you're familiar with their work. And for anybody who isn't, they are a advocacy group in Ottawa, advocating for biblical policies and positions. They do a lot of great work, and they've been on the show before. We've had, back when Mark Penning was over there, he came on the show to talk about the kind of the story of ARPA, and way back in the early days, we also had Andre Schuten on as well to talk about, I believe it was COVID at that point. So we've been, and of course I should not forget Ryan as well. Ryan Mance has been on the show to talk about his story and the work he's doing at ARPA as the Ontario manager. So we've had a number of ARPA guests over the years, and it's a pleasure today to be joined by John Sycamore, the Director of Law and Policy for ARPA Canada, and then also by Levi Minderhout, who is the BC manager for ARPA. So today's topic we are talking about their new fall tour coming up, which is entitled Let Kids Be. Talking a lot about conversion therapy, gender confusion, just general Pride Month, these type of things. It's a very broad subject in a lot of ways, and these two gentlemen, I think, will do a great job of breaking down the issue for us in terms of just letting kids be, let kids be kids, and the attack we see on our kids today in the culture at large. So for starters, gentlemen, I will throw it over to Levi, and then we'll go to John just to introduce yourselves, a bit of what you do at ARPA, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Levi Minderhout. I've been involved for ARPA for 4 full years now, so it's coming up on 5. I grew up in the Fraser Valley, so Abbotsford, Mission, Aldergrove, that region. Spent most of my life down there. Attended United Reformed Church there. Still attend the one that I grew up in. I went to Dordt University in Northwest Iowa for my undergrad in political science, economics, business. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to intern for a member of parliament in Ottawa, Mark Warwa. He was a MP from BC who was a passionate defender of palliative care and of life. And unfortunately, he also needed palliative care before he passed away a few years ago. So I did that. And then right after that undergrad, I got a master's of public policy from Simon Fraser University. And then just as I was exiting that degree, ARPA put out the call looking for their very first BC manager. I applied, and they let me in, and the rest is history. And I've been the BC manager for ARPA Canada ever since.
Very good. Over to you, John.
You mentioned the title of Director of Law and Policy. That's kind of self-explanatory. I get to work with Levi and others on policy matters. I also get to do some legal advocacy for ARPA, sometimes as an intervener, and occasionally as a party, taking one level or other of government to court. So yeah, I also have a political science background and law, and did a master's in law and religion, which it's kind of an interesting intersection of fields there. And yeah, very privileged to work with the team here at ARPA.
Very good, very good. Well, Levi, just an interesting side note. I just had a podcast with Dordt University. We chatted about their policies and their programs and whatnot too. So if any listeners are listening to this podcast, which should be released following that one, feel free to go back and check that one out if you haven't. It was a good podcast. So a little bit inter-podcast promotion aside, we'll get into the issues at hand here. So yeah, I think we should set the scene for ourselves, for our listeners. Like, we're at a strange point by many aspects in our culture. Many things that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago are now commonplace and promoted broadly and widely throughout the culture, throughout the Western world. Just these transition surgeries for young children, which is part of the primary focus of today's episode, are commonplace and are very problematic and are causing a lot of hurt and a lot of pain for many kids around the world, and especially here in the Western world too. So I think I'll throw it over to you, Levi, You've authored a number of policy reports on this matter. If you want to kind of set the scene for how did we get here? How did this become so commonplace? And what was kind of the value shift we've seen? I guess maybe you could talk about the theories and the ideas of it behind it, but also just like politically, how have we seen this shift happen over the last, let's say, 15 years or so?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And this whole episode, we could turn into basically just a history of how we got here. I know I haven't had the opportunity to read the book, but I know a frequent podcast guest, Reverend Witteveen, I think just wrote a book about how did we get here. I'm not sure how much she talks about gender and gender identity in the book. But one really other good book on that whole topic is one by Carl Trueman, Brave New or Strange New World. So that's a really good job of kind of tracking the history of the development of ideas about gender and gender identity and what he calls expressive individualism. But basically the heart of how this issue really came into the modern public square. You can go back at different points of history. But maybe I'll just start actually with a common place where we also start in the Reformed community, and that is with the Reformation. Now, the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Renaissance that all started coming out around the same time. They had a very different attitude to authority. In the Reformed tradition and out of the Reformation, there was a lot of beneficial aspects to that, pushing back against the bad authority and the misuse of authority from the Catholic Church. And so they rightly push back and try to change the authority structures there. But out of that Reformation and then subsequently into the Enlightenment and to humanism, that mistrust of authority started coming out and playing out in more and more different areas and different avenues of life. So various philosophers and various theorists, they started applying the idea that authority does not come from the church and it doesn't come from God first and foremost. And more over the course of hundreds of years, that locus of authority really changed from God and from the church and became more and more centered in the individual. And so this is what Carl Trueman called expressive individualism, that I get to express myself however I see fit, however I think is best, and however I feel. And in some ways, we've pointed out as ARPA, and I know some other ministers have pointed this out, that in some ways this is kind of a return to the ancient heresy of Gnosticism, the idea that we have a physical body and a immaterial soul, and the two are at war with each other, and some are good and some are bad. And eventually we got to the point through this expressive individualism that they began to more and more see and identify the true self with not the body, but what is inside the body, basically the soul or the spirit or the mind, or however they want to conceive of it and to think of it. But as you start emphasizing that rational, that internal, that mind, that soul over other things, then you get to a place where the body matters less and less. And so when we get to a place today, is specifically in terms of gender and sexuality, where it doesn't really matter what your body is, because your body isn't authoritative. God's design for the body and for gender isn't authoritative. What is authoritative in the mind of our culture is our inner selves, our true selves, what we think of as ourselves. And so a natural expression of this, if that's your basis, if that's your underlying logic, is something like medical transitioning, where you think of yourself as a boy trapped in a girl's body, or a boy or a girl trapped in a boy's body, a phrase that a couple decades ago even would have been nonsensical for the average person. But because this is now the worldview of our society, that it's not even given a second glance, and actually the main response of our society is not to get them to rethink that idea and the absurdity of it, but to in fact say, we are going to take your self-identity, how you conceive of yourself in your mind, and we're going to take that at face value, and we are going to landscape, we are going to change, we are going to modify the human body to align with your identity. Ultimately, it's rejection and rebellion against God and his purposes for human beings and for human bodies. Most people, of course, don't see it that way in our modern world, where we don't, again, give much credence to the authority of God, the authority of scriptures, and the authority of the church. But that's how many people think of it today, very sadly.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, and I'll get to you, John, in a second there, but do you think, just as a quick follow-up to that, Levi, that why we haven't seen that much pushback until maybe recently, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in the broader culture on this issue is because of this, the locus of power or the locus of authority is in oneself. So we have this live and let live type culture. So there really is no ground to push back when something crazy like this comes along.
Yeah, I think that's you hit the nail on the head right there. That the locus of authority is that on human autonomy, literally human individual self-law. And so it's not, of course, restricted to this issue. The whole dialogue around abortion is framed of choice and of my body, my choice. Euthanasia is framed of as a choice. And even on issues that we are sympathetic to, like school choice is often something that's put out there, or vaccine choice, or conscience, all of these things. Some of them may be good because we do have the freedom as people of God and as Christians to choose between alternatives. We're not slaves to any particular thing. Freedom is a good thing. But if you overemphasize that and solely focus on human autonomy and choice, then it becomes basically a God that everything else has to be subservient to. And I think you see that in all sorts of different issues in society today. It's one of the fundamental things that we as Christians need to push back against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we certainly need to be aware of that. John, on your end of things in the legal realm, has this, I'm sure it has, this way of thinking made its way into the legal realm? Has there been any key decisions or any key, legal decisions made in the last like 10, 15 years that have really shifted the tide on this issue? Or has a lot of it actually just been people just letting people get away with these kind of policies, especially around children, and there is really no good legal structure in place?
Yeah, I think on the gender issue specifically, we've seen gender identity, gender expression added to human rights laws in the last decade. But I think there is kind of a continuation of this this new anthropology shaping the law, right? Already in the 90s, we had courts reading protections based on sex or sexual equality in the law as basically meaning gender identification, the way you define your own sexual identity. So it's already been interpreted that way for decades, and this has just kind of been more and more solidified in law. But I'd like to pick up on something Levi said that was interesting about mentioning euthanasia and abortion and autonomy, and certainly autonomy is probably the leading value or principle, if you will, in the development of our law today. This right of self-definition and what goes with it, this kind of expectation of social recognition for that. But that these things, we're talking about gender and sexuality today, and that's the subject of our reports and fall tour. But these things are connected. There was a recent study released by, I believe it was Mark Rigneris, and he found that one of the best predictors of whether someone supports so-called gender affirming care is not their age or their political leanings or a number of other factors, but whether or not they support abortion or the right to choose. And that's very interesting, right? And he explains it as, again, being connected to this anthropology, this view of what does it mean to be human, and do really our bodies have any meaning? And that's something where, Lucas, you started by asking about, how do we get here? Truman opens his book by asking, how did we get to a place where it makes sense to say that a man could be trapped in or someone could say, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, for example. How does that statement even make sense? And Nancy Pearcey's book, Love Thy Body, where she does cover a number of these issues, says that it's one other factor she points to is Darwinism and secularism pushing God out of the picture and basically saying we have this material universe, but what does it mean? And Darwinism basically says it doesn't mean anything, and therefore human bodies don't mean anything. And then what do we do with that religiously, philosophically? How do we respond to that if that's our starting point? If we actually believe that we just have this material world that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, it's probably here by accident. And the response as humans was basically, it's an existential crisis, but it was existentialism. It's, it has whatever meaning we give it. Man is what man makes of himself, and so we have these bodies that we get to define. We get to determine how we use. We say, we get to define them. We have an absolute claim over them, and we even get to name them. Piercy uses this analogy of, God is over the unformed, as yet unorganized matter that he's created, and he's organizing it. It's kind of like people standing over this physical world and saying, well, I'll make meaning of it. I'll say what it means, and I'll say who I am and what I get to do. And it's this kind of going back to the fall in Genesis 3. It's this kind of human assertion of this godlike place. And that's really what autonomy means, right? That we're a law unto ourselves. It's literally what the term means. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So is that where something, and maybe if you're describing this right now, but where social constructionism comes in, is kind of this battle of two anthropologies, as you mentioned, right? Man can make his own world and make of it what he wants, versus, the Imago Dei, God has created us, we have purpose. Those would be, I guess, the two kind of major competing worldviews then.
Yeah, I think where social construct comes into it, I might not apply that to what I was just saying in terms of this assertion that the individual can really define their own identity, but that the kind of as a group, society gives us these kinds of constructs. And I think that the social constructionists actually are using the concept of social constructions to in order to then deconstruct them. So let's take something like marriage or family, or what they call heteronormativity, or cisgenderism. They'll say this expectation that we conduct ourselves sexually this way, right? That a man should unite exclusively with one woman. That is just a social construct. That's not intrinsically right or wrong. It's just something that society has formed as a social expectation for complex reasons. But that's all it is. It's not intrinsically meaningful or intrinsically right. And so that's where I do see that as connected, right? Because again, it's just, there's no intrinsic meaning. That's a meaning that maybe I haven't chosen for myself, but that has been socially constructed for me. And some of these social constructs can then be oppressive and limiting of my freedom when there's no intrinsic or transcendent reason for me to be limited by such a social construct.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that's helpful. I understand that. Go ahead, Levi.
I was going to say just one thing on that. You kind of pitted like social constructivism versus like basically a Bible or biblical view. And I think for this issue of gender and sexuality, that very much can be a beneficial way of putting it, because as John said, the biblical view is that there are transcendence, there are norms around gender and sexuality that we ought to promote as Christians and as human beings. They don't just get invented by society like that. But just so that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, in every area of life, it's not that whenever you hear the term social constructionism, that is necessarily bad. There are certain things in our lives that, by human activities, we do give meaning to. And the one example that we give in the policy report is, for instance, the value of our modern currency. Like our currency in Canada is the Canadian dollar. It's not backed up by gold or any precious metals. It basically has value because, well, fundamentally, the government says it's valuable. And even behind that, because we agree that it has value. If Canada were to be taken over by another foreign nation, if there was rampant inflation, if the government decided to have a new currency, then the Canadian dollar would be worthless because we collectively don't think it has value anymore. And so that's an example of where the idea, the philosophy of social constructivism actually has some value, but it just can't be applied all around the entire world. Like many things in the world, something can have some good to it intrinsically, but to make it the centerpiece of all of human life and the explanation for all things, it makes it an idol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So primarily, it's honestly probably used as a tool more for deconstruction, kind of like you mentioned, John. It's more for pulling it apart, and then our society has done that, as you mentioned, to you have marriage, family, a lot of these foundational societal building blocks, right? Which leaves us really with only the self. And so now we're back to the self again. We determine our own identities and our own norms, whatnot. So then we come to this battle of opposing anthropologies, which is self-expressive individualism on the one hand versus Imago Dei anthropology on the other hand. Levi, do you want to break down these two competing views for us?
Yeah, sure. And just to start off, in case our listeners aren't familiar with the idea, anthropology basically means a view of man, a view of humanity. What do you think human beings are? As we've talked about a little bit about the self-expressive individual, the idea that fundamentally the view of man is that we are rational, autonomous human beings. We can make whatever choice we want. We are king, we are master of our own destiny, of our own fate. And what we decide is good is what is good. And that's the idea of self-expressive individualism. But the model of anthropology that comes from Christianity really is centered on the idea of the image of God, the Imago Dei. And so we learn from scripture as we read through, even from the beginning verses of Genesis, that there is a purpose to humanity that we don't just get to invent for ourselves. God creates human beings in his image, male and female, he created them. And that is the fundamental verse about how men and women were created. And we learn out through the rest of the narrative of scripture what that means for every single person made in the image of God. And in some cases, what that specially means for men and specially means for women. But fundamentally, behind that anthropology, that we are made in the image of God, that gives us an essence of what human beings are and what we have created to do. We have more value than other creatures, other animals, because we were specially made in God's image in that way. We have a purpose to us to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, to fulfill the cultural mandate, to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That's something that's specially made in what it means to be made in the image of God. But especially when it comes to the question of being male and female, we're made in the image of God, sexually dimorphous, male and female. For one reason is to just reflect the need for relationship. So God is the Trinity. He's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there's a relationship in that Trinity. And so if God just created us one human being and left it at that, well, there'd be no human relationship there, no need for it. But of course, God sees that it's not good for man to be alone. He created a helper suitable for him. And they were different and made to come together in difference, but in unity as well. And so that's just one of the kind of theological aspects behind what it means to be made in the image of God. And then applying that forward, that means that we're made for relationships, that we're made different, means that we don't get to just invent ourselves however we want. We are made with a purpose and with a specific nature. We're not meant to make decisions by ourselves. We're meant to make decisions with other people in mind and in consultation with other people. Fundamentally, that idea that we're made in the image of God doesn't start with us. It starts with God, and then everything flows out from that. Instead of the other way around, where we think of today from expressive individual, humanism, secularism, whatever you want to call it, they start with the human being, and everything goes out from there. But we start with God and his image and make our anthropology, make our entire worldview flow from that.
Right. Okay. That's good. So I think we have a handle on the backdrop in terms of at least we're setting the scene, the ideas at play, how we kind of got here from an ideas perspective. Now I think we got to get a kind of a handle on some of these terms because, yeah, they can be hard to understand, especially if you're not like having your mind in the gender debate all the time, and if you're just a regular Joe working your job and you hear these terms like gender identity, gender expression, gender dysphoria. Okay, how are these different terms? How are they distinct? What do they all mean? John, are you able to break down some of those terms for us and kind of explain what's going on when people are using these?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, and Levi does a good job of explaining this, but the gender and sex at one point in history basically mean the same thing. Gender sometimes is used as a linguistic terms. You might talk about, gendered pronouns and so on. That obviously having, again, still corresponding to the fact that gender, sex is binary, but gender, I think, first starts to take on a meaning beyond that, to kind of say, well, there's sex is natural, sex is biological, and then gender starts to be used in a way that denotes the kind of social meaning and social expression of sexual difference. And I don't think that development is necessarily bad. To have a term that's like, okay, well, yeah, sex means, maybe it was more specific to the biological difference in the reality that God created us male and female. Gender can mean, maybe gender roles, gender, gendered clothing, things that we see. Yeah, we have different cultures might express sexual difference in different ways that are not necessarily right or wrong. It's just like these are social cues. In one context, a woman might dress some way, and in that culture, you would know, even someone far away, the way they're dressed, that's a woman over there. That's a gender cue, if you will, that corresponds to. It's related to sex, but you can use the terms to mean slightly different things, but they're still related. But eventually, gender kind of becomes separated from sex in a more fundamental way, such that we get gender identity. And this is this kind of ill-defined, sense of being male or female. So it kind of, apart from the body, gender is kind of circularly defined today, but it's regardless of what your biology is, your inner sense of being masculine or feminine, male or female, and your body is seen as not determining that. So it's kind of this bifurcated anthropology that you can be someone else in your mind or spirit, essentially, than someone else than you are in your body, right? And that disembodied self in the mind is more important than your body. So you hear phrases like in a BBC documentary on transgenderism, for example, someone said, basically, I can be a who I choose to be, regardless of the meat skeleton that I was born in. Or why should a piece of flesh between my legs define who I am? Why should I let that define me? Like, I'm not going to be limited. There's a sense in which we still sense that our maleness or femaleness is essential to our identity. It's hard to escape that, although some people, of course, claim to be non-binary. But then there's also this sense of the body being received and not chosen is therefore a limit on my freedom and my self-definition. So there's that also kind of rejection of the body to say what's in my mind will trump what's in my body. And if I want to, I can change my body to better fit how I feel or how I want to express myself. And that's kind of the manifestation of gender identity today as more important than bodily sex.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then when someone is experiencing gender dysphoria, can you go into that a little bit for us?
Yeah. Gender dysphoria, I understand it to be, and Levi might want to jump in here too, but basically dysphoria is a term that just means discomfort, distress. And as that relates to gender, it's known as kind of the discomfort associated with not feeling either comfortable in your body, specifically your sexed body, or even believing that you're in the wrong body, right? Wishing that you had a body more closely aligned with the other sex. So yeah, just that discomfort with your sex body is how I understand that term.
Yeah, and this is where there can be different nuances in language. So from a Christian perspective, we would say that anyone who thinks that they are a different gender than how they were born, that they experience some sort of confusion, maybe some discomfort, maybe something called dysphoria, something like that. So we might think from our perspective, anyone who claims to be a different gender than how they are born has dysphoria. But actually, gender dysphoria is still technically considered to be a mental illness. So in the APA DSM-5, like you talk about gender identity as gender dysphoria as a specific mental illness. And same with the other main document that is it keeps a tab and keeps a tabulation of what are mental illnesses, the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. They also talk about gender dysphoria or gender incongruence as being something that is still a medically diagnosable problem. And so I think we'll get into this in a sec, but that's one of the reasons why we see this coming into the medical realm is because in our society today, and historically, we've viewed something like gender dysphoria, a discomfort between your body and what you think of yourself in your head, that discomfort or that confusion. They still think that thing as a medical problem, a mental health problem, not just something that is a difference in anthropologies or a difference in belief or a difference in worldview.
Yeah, so it's assumed. Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. It's assumed that it's fine. It's just like a different medical issue to deal with, and we will, apply the various surgeries and treatments as needed. Okay, so yeah, it's primarily it's a disorder of the mind, not the body. I believe that was a quote in one of the policy reports you had there. So, do you want to get into a bit the trend we've seen in probably again like the last 5-10 years? About rapid onset gender dysphoria and how it kind of seems to come in waves, maybe, or like bunches, and especially in groups of young girls.
Yeah.
See many a podcast talk about that. You want to talk about that phenomenon a bit?
Yeah. So, not that we have statistics from the whole course of human history, but it seemed to right up about until 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was a very, very small number of children, specifically boys, who had something akin to gender dysphoria, so that and it would be almost always be there before puberty. So before they had gone through all the changes, the complex changes that come through puberty, they were discomfortable or uncertain about their gender, and then they're placed in God's will before puberty. But after puberty, as they went through that process of maturing, then in the vast majority of situations, that would go away naturally, and they would be comfortable to be as full-grown adult men. And so that's what gender dysphoria was historically. But in the last, like I said, 10, 15 years, we've seen a massive reversal where it's not pre-puberty young boys exhibiting gender dysphoria or some sort of confusion here. It's now trended so that almost, or not all, that's a little bit hyperbole, but the vast majority of gender dysphoria happening to girls and to teenage girls after they have had the changes of puberty there. And so, as you said, there's this one landmark study that has received a lot of criticism, mostly because it doesn't align with many people's understanding or preferred understanding of gender and sexuality. There's one study by a journalist called, former journalist Lisa Littman, where she basically looked and said, you are, or a teenage girl was more likely to identify as transgender if she had transgender friends. Basically, the implication being is that it is something that you might not just get from your day-to-day life, but if you have friends or if you have exposure to people who identify as trans, then you are more likely to identify that way. And even more shockingly, sometimes whole groups or friend groups or clusters of girls, 5, 7, 10 girls, all of a sudden would come out and identify as transgender together. And statistically, that's like impossible. There's no way in the terms of statistics when it's only a tiny, tiny percentage of a population that can come out. And so she came up with this new term called rapid onset gender dysphoria to document the new phenomenon, not happening in young boys, but now in teenage girls, of just a whole slew of young girls deciding that we don't want to be girls anymore, we don't feel like girls anymore, and we identify as boys, and we want to transition. So that's what's meant by the new term, rapid onset gender dysphoria, and you can see that anywhere you look in statistics. Like the best charts, a source of statistics on gender dysphoria comes from the UK, and that's simply because they're relatively small, but small in terms of geography, but large in terms of population. So they only had one gender clinic. So anyone who had gender dysphoria or was suffering confusion there, they were all sent to the same place. And so for a long time, for years, it was just like covering like a couple cases every year. And then in around 2000, 2008, it started to go up a little bit more, and then it basically just spikes all the way up. As far as you can see, so something, whenever you see something that grows by like 500 or 1000%. Those aren't very normal rates of change, especially when it comes to demography and demographics. So when you see that, that's usually a red flag saying there's something that really, really changed here, and it's something that's really different.
For sure. Definitely a rapid increase in gender dysphoria for sure. John, can you get into gender affirming care a little bit for us? Some of the many of the pitfalls of this gender affirming care approach that is been played out across all these many, especially as you mentioned, Levi, young girls who are coming into these clinics, and some of the problems that exist with this approach, and then even any current legal issues that are kind of arising after people start to transition back to their original sex.
Sure. So yeah, let's just first maybe cover what's included in gender affirming care.
Sure.
That terribly a terrible phrase, but three things. One is puberty blocking drugs. Second is cross-sex hormones, and third would be surgeries. National Post released an article recently on how common it seems that mastectomies are becoming among minors. And I believe that the WPATH guidelines on this are that mastectomies can be done earlier than hysterectomies and other procedures to remove or reconstruct genitalia. That they try to push those to when someone's older, but those things. So puberty blockers already, as you know, these have been kind of sold as, well, putting a pause on puberty. The reality is that almost all children who start on puberty blockers will go on to receive cross-sex hormones. And puberty blockers, they are, what they sound like. Sometimes they will start early on in puberty. Sometimes they'll start, a couple years into puberty, but often in response to the distress that a child is feeling with, if they identify, if they've come to believe that they are, let's say a girl truly believes that she's a boy or should be a boy, then as her body develops to become into a sexually mature female, that becomes distressing because it's out of line with her self-concept. And the standard approach now is to treat the body as the problem. And so the first step in that is normally puberty blockers, and then, like I said, cross-sex hormones. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest, and Levi researched this closely, just to suggest that the health impacts of this can be quite devastating. So I won't comment more on those, some of the many health implications of that, but even just in terms of sexual development, the reality is that a boy who starts puberty blockers early on in puberty or before puberty and proceeds to cross-sex hormones just won't develop the capacity not only to have children, but even to have a sexual relationship. And if that then progresses maybe a few years later to surgeries, then obviously having children is out of the question. So just in that sense, in terms of your sexual capacity, your capacity for forming a relationship or being married or having children, it's a path to destroying that. I think that's very serious. And I would just say too that gender dysphoria in boys is increasing as well. Levi's right that the social contagion aspect is far more pronounced among young girls, but the numbers overall are increasing. And I think that's, we're basically seeing what some people are calling a medical crisis or the biggest, medical scandal of our time.
Well, feel free to weigh in, Levi.
Oh yeah, sorry. And I was just gonna comment in probably like analogy. It just came to me today as I was doing some other work. But if you know history, so in China, decades, centuries ago, they used to practice something called foot binding. The idea that it was attractive for girls to have really small feet. And so what they would do as the girls grew up is that they would just bind the feet with a lot of cloth really, really tight, and essentially do it so tight that the girls' feet were not allowed to grow. So imagine a fully grown human being, normally proportioned, but they have the feet size of a I don't know, pick a 7-year-old, and they did this to try to fundamentally reshape the human body of these girls. But then they can walk properly. They have super deformed feet because they were so compressed. And eventually, the Christian influence reached China and helped to end this practice and say, no, we're not going to put children and young people through something that is so debilitating. And that just came to mind to me. That's basically what puberty blockers do today. They try to stop the normal human development and not just pause it, not just say, oh, we don't want you to grow a little bit more hair on your head. It's not just something like that. Like they are fundamentally stopping a human person from developing the way that God intended them to. And that's like, if you think about it, if you really take a second or a minute to think about what that is, it's just crazy to think. We wouldn't condone today that foot binding as a Chinese practice because we like small feet. People rightfully would speak up and say, no, that is terrible for the influence and the appearance and the well-being of a child. And so we do not want that to be condoned in any circumstance. And yet today we're at such a point where a comparable procedure, like something that's comparable, puberty blockers, just to start, even that is a no, that's just puts a pause on something. It's all fine. It's all good. We don't really care about this. Actually, this is a beneficial way for people to explore their identity. Like they aren't understanding the comparisons about where we've been as a society in other parts of the world hundreds of years ago, and they don't see that they're doing something comparable today.
Mm-hmm. How does consent work for something like that? Is there a consistent age limit across the country? Is it different province to province? And like how involved do parents get to be? Let's put it that way, as far as the government looks at it.
Yeah, good question. There's kind of standard legal doctrine, which is what's called mature minors. And in healthcare, that basically means where, so ordinarily a parent's consent is needed to give a child medical treatment. Parents consent on behalf of the child, but where in the doctor's view, the child is mature enough to understand the nature of the treatment, its risks and consequences, the child can consent on their own behalf, right? Now, parents might challenge that in court. That actually happened in a case in British Columbia where a father challenged a gender clinic's, green lighting at the time, I believe she was 13 when she started, his daughter started testosterone, taking synthetic testosterone, and he lost that in court. And so it's really there's obviously a normative judgment involved in that. I mean, can a 13, 14-year-old understand the implications, the consequences of going through treatments and procedures that will render them, in the case of mastectomies, unable to breastfeed. In the case of cross-sex hormones, a woman on cross-sex hormones for a certain period of time may essentially destroy her ovaries, her reproductive capacity, even before having surgery, or those hormones may make surgery necessary because of the damage done to those reproductive organs. Can someone that age, who's never had a sexual relationship, is too young to have to be married or to have a mature sexual relationship or to have children, really understand the lifelong implications of that? And our culture is saying yes. That a lot of these children are showing maturity, and they can make these decisions. And I think that implicit in that is a kind of devaluing of meaningful marriage and family life later in life, that's not as important as asserting and realizing your gender identity today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Sad. It's just sad to see where it's at, honestly. We talked about a little bit in this outline here, the wait and see approach. Now, this will be something that I think ARPA, we would be in favor of generally. Is there good stats, Levi, to back this up, this approach, that a lot of these kids do end up growing out of this dysphoria and this discomfort?
Yeah. So the wait and see approach is so because this rapid onset gender dysphoria is such a new phenomenon, like there's not a lot of information about outcomes yet, and what would happen over the course of someone's life if nothing was done. I mean, what studies there are so far are not super encouraging, or not giving much support to the identity that they should medically transition. But the wait and see approach has been around for a very long time when it comes to what I was mentioning earlier, those pre-puberty young boys who experience gender dysphoria. And all the studies, multiple studies that were done on them over the course of 10, 20 years, many decades ago already, they found that 80% of those boys, after they went through puberty, would grow up to be healthy, happy men without any questions about gender issues or confusion about their gender. 80%. The problem today now is that we basically have taken that statistic and said, well, we don't actually really care what would happen if we just left kids alone. Instead, what we want to do is actively encourage them or actively push them down the road to transitioning, because for whatever reason, that's what they prefer to see, rather than just letting nature take their course and letting fundamentally them figure out who they are. Go ask any person, any 8-year-old, any 12-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up? Follow them 10 years later, and they're probably not going to be in the same line of work as what they thought as a child. And that's just something like vocation. It can be way different and way more uncertain, as John was talking about. If you're talking about even more weighty matters, is do I fundamentally change or have surgery or mutilate the body that I have now?
Did that study talk about what they ended up identifying as, like, sexually? Because I feel like I've heard that study referenced on other podcasts before, and often they say most of the kids turn out to be gay, choose to live a gay lifestyle. You know what I mean? Like, is that was that part of the study? And as a follow up to that, wouldn't there be people in the LG part of the LGBT lobby who would be on the side of, like, let's not do this kind of treatment to kids, because in their view it's hurting all these young gay kids?
Yeah, the studies that I've mentioned, I'm not sure if they actually go into the sexual orientation part of it, but there are lots of studies out there that basically find a similar conclusion. Yes, that these people, or young kids who don't act the way that other boys do, for example, a boy doesn't act like other boys, that they are more likely to be gay when they reach adulthood, or girls in the same way. And so there is a lot of that, like, just as you said, on that topic.
Okay, interesting.
I think
go ahead, John.
just as Christians, we need to be careful here. I think there is indeed evidence that children who are strongly gender non-conforming from a young age are more likely later on to adopt either lesbian or gay identity or a transgender identity, right? But the narrative is in part that we're medicalizing even neutering gay children, right? These are gay children. This is basically their essence, and we are medicalizing away the next population of gay children. And where I think caution is called for there is that this too, to say these are gay children, right, is already applying a kind of cultural framework to interpreting their gender nonconformity, right? And again, this is I'm just thinking of Nancy Pearcey's book, where she talks about Christians in different fields. She talks about a number of Christian Girl Scout leaders who knew each other, who end up identifying as lesbian because their independence, their outdoorsiness, their ruggedness, they kind of interpret that as meaning that they are lesbian. And she's saying often these things of temperament that make us uncomfortable, feel like we don't belong in the gender that we belong to, can be interpreted in complex ways. And that's, I want to be careful not to give a reductive explanation of people's experience of sexual attraction, which is very complex. It's dealt with in much more detail in our report. It's often not subject to our control, but I think we also need to avoid the reductionism of saying what's happening is medicalizing gay children. I think as Christians we need to point again to this, if you will, body positivity, that our identity is defined as male and female. That's how God created us. and then how we live that out in terms of expressing gender, and also in terms of how we conduct ourselves sexually, and how we evaluate our own sexual feelings, right? That has to be done in light of God's creational norms as taught to us in both scripture and kind of through general revelation, right?
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I'm not trying to. Yeah, it's wise to exercise caution on that point. I think I was more thinking on a political level, if there was any sort of alignment there. If you've seen that kind of messaging from within the LGBT lobby, if there's a bit of a split on that regard, because I would think if that there would be some internal conflict there at least.
Yeah. And there definitely is. Like if you read Strange New World or Truman's other larger book, he goes quite into detail about the splits within the LGBTQI plus community. Like all the splits in like basically they're the way they go together. Like there are something called TERFs. There are trans exclusatory radical feminists that are basically thrown out of the feminist or camp because of their perspectives there. There's organizations, and the one that comes to mind is Gays Against Groomers, which again precisely thinks like, oh, we need to stop this medicalization of gay children. But at the end of the day, as Christians, we're not going to be saying like that transgender is being better than gay, or that bisexual person is better than being transgender. Like there's no value equations there that one is worse. And even broader to this, all sexual sin is bad. It doesn't matter if it is something, someone looking at pornography of the same sex, that's not going to be better than someone who identifies as gay, for example. Like they are all forms of sexual sin, and regardless of how they manifest themselves, they are all right in the sight of God. And we all should strive to align human action, human thought, human behavior, human attractions towards how God has identified in the Word. It's not just about sexual orientation and gender identity. There's a whole host of other sexual sins that I think we do need to be careful sometimes as Christians not to say, yeah, these are the real bad ones that we're going to focus on, and give less attention to other sorts of sexual sins as well. Unfortunately, when it comes to this issue, the government isn't publicly subsidizing these sins and behaviors in the way that they're publicly subsidizing medical transitions, for example.
Yes. No, and that's good to keep in mind as we all deal with this issue, engage with this issue, not to get on our high horse, and to be aware of the log in our own eye, so to speak, as well. But there are definitely still very many reasons to be engaged on this issue. Of course, one of those being to help protect the vulnerable, especially the young who are being targeted with this ideology, with this approach of treating with gender affirming care. Of course, recently in the last couple of years, we've seen this conversion therapy law here in Canada. Can you guys touch on that a little bit? Like, what does this law restrict? How does this play out for churches? I think this has been touched on before by ARPA, but it'd be good to review where we stand actually, and what are we legally allowed to do, and how to be wise about going forward with that. So maybe I'll throw it to John first on this one, if you want to speak to some of that, and then back to Leva.
Sure. Yeah. To be as brief as I can, Canada now, through its criminal law, prohibits, I believe it's practice, treatment, and one other thing, but somewhat of a formal. Sorry, Levi.
Service,
practice, treatment, or service, designed to change someone's sexual orientation to heterosexual, or to change their gender identity to cisgender. It doesn't go the other way. The ban is specifically that. So trying to push, gender nonconforming or sexual minorities into what you might call or what some people might call heteronormativity or cisnormativity. That's the ban. And now with the Department of Justice documents that go with that, they're not as clear as they should be, but there's some indication that doesn't include any conversation or let's say any religious teaching. It's some kind of formal one-on-one, something akin to counseling, but maybe not quite. They definitely could have made it more clear. So it seems like the leaving it broad in the text of the law itself was maybe intended to send a message, even while the Justice Department said, "Oh, don't worry, this isn't absurdly abroad as to be unconstitutional." But that's the reality. We now have it written in our law that you can't try to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity in that way. But not only that, it says you can't try to reduce their same-sex sexual attraction or behavior as well, which our culture sees as intimately connected with one's sexual identity, right? One's sexual feelings and one's sexual behavior. And so for Christians, of course, we look at that and say, so basically teaching a Christian sexual ethic, or at least counseling a person one-on-one to conform to a Christian sexual ethic, would appear to be a potential crime. I think one I don't know if it's a silver lining or one encouraging aspect of this is I think that for people who have helped Christians with gender struggles or same-sex sexual attraction, that what people often find more helpful is, again, this return to a Christian anthropology. So not a focus on your feelings, not let's come up with some technique to get rid of those, same-sex sexual feelings and to manufacture some heterosexual attraction. That doesn't really work well and often does produce some distress, especially when certain results are promised that can't be delivered on. But in this kind of rooting people in the reality of God's good creation, we've included a story that, again, Nancy Pearcey includes in her book, but of a Christian man who said that by focusing on the fact that God made him a man, and what his body means, right? That he has the innate capacity to unite with a woman, that as he kind of learned the significance of that, his feelings of same-sex attraction started to appear to be what was less important. That was no longer what defined him. And I think that is still, at least teaching a Christian anthropology, is not prohibited by this law, and in some ways is the better approach to helping Christians and non-Christians who are struggling with same-sex attraction.
Yeah, the problem fundamentally, though, is that teaching the anthropology is still legal, but the purpose behind the bill is basically that Christian anthropology, a biblical understanding of sexual and gender identity, it basically calls that a myth. And of course, it's almost impossible for a government to regulate myths or belief in myths. And so that's primarily how the law is used today. There's not a high likelihood of people actually being complained about and convicted on this law and actually punished for it. The real purpose and the danger, to a large extent, is that that Christians are going to self-censor ourselves out of fear of potentially running afoul of the law. And so that's in legal literature or economic literature, sometimes it's called a chilling effect. Like they're trying to basically chill or dissuade people without actually using any force, not to promote a biblical view of gender and sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Looking more broadly for a minute here, and then we'll kind of get into what the campaign you guys are putting on this fall is all about. What are some other countries in the world doing, thinking especially here of the UK, in regards to kind of the reaction we've seen against this movement now, a little more in the broader culture, certainly in America, and I think a bit in the UK as well. What has that reaction been like, and are there any signs of encouragement that way, Levi?
Yeah, there definitely are. Just to take one step back for a second, though. The organization throughout the world that is, quote unquote, the expert on gender and medical transition is an organization called WPATH. I think John mentioned them earlier. It stands for the World Psychological Association for Transgender Health, or something like that. And anyways, so they are the organization that doctors and medical practitioners have looked to about how do we treat this? How do we go about talking and medicalizing and doing surgery about this? So they've kind of looked to this one international medical activist organization for all their guidance. But what happens when countries actually take the time with their own medical establishments on their own research to take a look at what the evidence is in the academic literature, they realize that, like John and I outlined, there are a ton of risks, medical risks to all of these medically and surgical transitioning procedures. And kids have really difficult time consenting if they can consent at all. So basically, when countries decide to do their own medical reviews of the literature, they say, hold it, having no age requirements, no official age requirements on all this stuff, like WPATH suggests. They say there's no actually minimum age you need to be before you can get this type of transition. So looking at all of that, countries are saying we're going to actually put in evidence-based policy. So countries like, I believe Finland was actually the first one to review it and basically say, okay, we are going to make sure at the very least that you have to be over 18, not a minor, not a child anymore, in order to have those cross-sex hormones or that gender reassignment surgery. Sweden set the ages at like 16 and 18. The UK is also doing 16 for cross-sex hormones and 18 for gender, like for like surgical transitioning. And more countries are actually coming to these standards that there has to be a minimum age requirement, at the very least, to tackle the question of consent. And then also saying that we're only going to provide these treatments. We're not going to provide them as a first step or first reaction to gender dysphoria, but we're going to do a lot of time digging into a person's psychological history. They have histories of abuse or other comorbid conditions. Let's go through every single possible thing that we can think of to try to alleviate and resolve and help this person live with their gender dysphoria before we start medicating and before we start doing surgical transitions. So that's happening all over the developed world. Yeah, UK is actually a really good case of that. There's a great book. Beautiful is not the right word. I have it on my shelf. It's Time to Think by Hannah Barnes. She spends a whole book documenting how all of this has transpired in the United Kingdom. And yeah, the problem with Canada, though, is we haven't done the literature review. We haven't looked into the evidence. And so while many other countries are coming up with all sorts of safeguards and requirements and better ways to handle this entire topic, Canada has basically said, yeah, we're just going to continue looking to that international medical activist organization and just have no age requirements, and just say whenever doctors feel like they want to, or whenever they're of the opinion it might help, that we're going to continue to do this and make it the first treatment available rather than going through all the other difficulties and potential problems that gender dysphoric kids might have.
Okay. Did you want to weigh in on that, John, or?
No, I mean, I'm encouraged by those developments. It's also interesting, like Levi mentioned, Sweden. Sweden was actually a pioneer in delivering these gender affirming treatments to minors, and now they only allow it, like Levi said, let's do psychiatric treatment first if we can. And now you're not allowed to generally prescribe it. It's not a general health option. Someone has to actually be enrolled in a clinical trial. So again, it's not a complete ban, which I think would be justified, but it's much more controlled. So some of these very, very secular progressive nations are taking a step back, which is encouraging, and we do hope to promote that in Canada as well.
Yeah, they basically say, they actually use the terminology and recognize that this is a ongoing experiment. Like, that's actually some of the words that they use, and I realize, yeah, sometimes that puts it in a bad way, but they use that language, and so this is going to be an experiment. Let's make sure that we are doing it the way we've decided to do experiments in all our ways of society, and have control groups and take every precaution to make sure that things aren't abused and things like that. So yeah.
Wow, crazy. Okay, well then, how are we going to raise the alarm bells here in Canada and get some action going? I mean, obviously part of that is this campaign. What's this campaign about exactly? What are you going to be talking about in the presentation? I think by the time this drops, most people have had an opportunity to see you guys come through their local area if they live in Canada. Yeah, if you want to just get the highlights of that, that'd be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. So the main focus of this Let Kids Be campaign is pretty simple. We just want, in some ways you could say, it's like we need a law. Like, we need a law for abortion, but we need a law about medical transitioning. And that law should be that we do not have medical or surgical transitions for minors at all. We have a blanket ban on them for a variety of reasons that we've outlined today. the problems, the risks associated with those transitions, the fact that many of them would actually that would resolve over the course of their lifetime if we let them develop the way that God intended them to, and the problem of consent. So we want that to be entirely illegal across Canada. And we've seen some encouraging signs already in this regard. We've seen some provincial political parties say that parents need to be more involved in these types of questions with their children, particularly in schools. So at the very least, taking a step back and saying, no, that parents need to be involved in the decisions has been a good step. One of Canada's political parties, the Conservative Party, recently passed a policy at their last convention with the exact same policy that we recommend, saying that they want to ban surgical and medical transitioning for minors. So sometimes actually that can even be a really good in, depending on who your member of parliament is. If they belong to the Conservative Party, if that's the case, and that is basically a way to raise it with them in a way that they can hear and sympathize with a little bit more. It's not just one person who decides that, yeah, this is really important to me, and so I'm going to talk to my member of parliament for them. It's actually something that the grassroots of the entire party have identified as an issue and that they want action on. But just one more thing on that is just the way that Canada is set up as a nation and our government is this is primarily an issue that falls to the various provinces. So sometimes we focus a lot on MPs and what happens in Ottawa, but this is a particular issue because it falls in the realm of health broadly that is up to provinces to take a stand on. So we love when people talk to their MP, but especially for an issue like this, we would love to see hundreds or thousands or ultimately tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people talk to their provincial MPP, their provincial MLA, and really urge them to start talking about and start introducing legislation or talking to their colleagues or all sorts of different things to try to push back against this fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem of gender dysphoria and the faulty solution that is promoted in our society today.
Some of the provinces I've noticed, I believe Manitoba, they're in the middle of election, I think, as we're recording this. The Conservative Party there is promising to ban this for minors, or are they promising more of a school choice, like parents need to be involved? There's something positive in that regard, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, Levi, go ahead.
Sorry, they definitely made a promise to when it's coming to parents and schools and being informed about the children's decision there. I have not heard anything about banning medical or surgical transitions. If that is the case, that'd be fantastic, but I haven't heard that quite yet.
Right. Okay, well, the baby steps, though. There was a premier out east as well, which I believe Trudeau has been trying to stick his nose into, and then I saw the other day Pierre Poilievre very firmly told Trudeau to stay out of it. So hopefully there will be some more autonomy given to the provinces that way, and we can make some good progress in that regard. John, do you want to touch on a few things that that you're part of and that you'll be talking about in this Let Kids Be campaign?
Yeah, maybe just let people in on a bit of the internal discussion at ARPA. I mean, these other policy areas matter to us too, and we will advocate on them when it comes to education, right? Parents should be informed about their children's gender identity at school. Often children are encouraged to explore their gender identity, maybe adopt a new gender identity at school without telling your parents. We want to see policies change on that, of course. One reason for focus on the medical transition was just this is an area we can find agreement with on a lot of people. It is an area where quite a few children are suffering irreversible damage by these procedures, and so this is in some ways a good entry point, but it's not the only one. And also we do see this again. ARPA is of course a Christian political advocacy organization, and so we are focused on the political and legal manifestations of some of these clashes of worldview and anthropologies, but we actually see this also as an opportunity in terms of Christian apologetics and evangelism. One of the reasons some people say that Christianity spread quite quickly among the downtrodden and among women in its early history is because of how it elevated women and also elevated the human body in a culture that degraded both. And if you weren't someone who was wealthy and powerful, you could be physically, sexually abused, and that was rampant in ancient pagan culture. And Christianity set up something that was very different. It said, look at the goodness of our bodies, and God wants us to respect and care for these bodies. And women or men are equal, and in marriage they're equal in the sense that the body of each belongs to another, right? The wife isn't the sexual property of her husband. And I do think that translates into this issue today, where we didn't really get into some of the, a lot of the causes of gender dysphoria and that whole wave. But I think a lot of people are struggling with, what does my body, my sexuality mean? Pornography use is rampant, and many children are exposed to it quite young, and it's very unsettling, right? What is the meaning of my body, my sexuality? For girls especially, it's being female isn't even safe in the way it's depicted in a lot of our culture and in pornography. And so there's this reaction of like, what is the body good? What does it mean? And Christianity has an answer to a lot of struggling, worried people on this. And so a question that might start, hey, how did our culture uses phrases like being yourself and, be who you are. Well, how did being yourself start to require major medical interventions? Like being myself requires surgery and lifelong drugs. That seems so out of step. And so you might start with that question, but then ask a few more, right? And to say, what do I do with my body? What is its meaning, and how can I live in this body in a way that is actually healthy and wholesome? And we have answers to that as Christians, right? We have a very positive view of the body as God's good creation, as a gift from Him, right? And I think that's just a wonderful message for a culture that's very confused. And some of these policy issues, as ARPA, our starting point isn't going to be evangelism, but it's there. This is all rooted in our Christian worldview and Christian motivations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fantastic opportunity, and that's a great perspective to kind of take us into the end of this discussion, end of the show here. It's a real opportunity. Well, first of all, because the time is now to help these kids. As you said, there's like from a political point of view, there's broad convergence on this issue, and it seems like a winnable one that we can get support to help all these kids out. And then also it's a chance to kind of put our foot in the door into the heart of this nation, right? The hearts of our fellow citizens, to open up a discussion about our faith and to be able to do that with people. So I'll flip it back to you, Levi. Anything you want to leave people with in terms of calls to action or anything, and then I'll give you one last chance, John, to say a few words if you want to do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Yeah, basically for action, as we'd love to see as many people contacting their provincial representatives as possible, urging them to take action on this. We have a website online, letkidsbe.ca, that really tries to approach the wider public the issues that are going on with medical and surgical transitioning, trying to get the broader public on board and active on this. There are flyers that people can then order and leave at kind of how we've done some other initiatives to go and stick them in mailboxes or in people's doors. One of the coolest things I thought as a chapter, an ARPA chapter that we have across the countries, there's many chapters, is some of them have even engaged their local school library and tried to recommend books that have a good perspective on these topics so that they're available for the public to read. I've even seen some be able to pass on and put our policy reports in the library for people to check out, which I think is super cool. These days with cancel culture, hopefully that would still pass muster, still happen. So those are action items there. But in overall, I would say just be hopeful. Is that this is an issue that often is hard to talk about, and sometimes it seems that it's going the wrong way. But at the end of the day, I was talking in conversation with a very senior former public servant. He spent his entire life in politics and civil service. As a Christian, he basically said that Christians should be the least cynical citizens of the country. The least cynical. Sometimes I think we're the most cynical, but we're the least cynical because we have a God that reigns over all of creation, and no matter what happens, he's always able to bring about change if that's his will. And miracles happen no matter what the trajectory can look like. He can change the world if he so desires. And even if it isn't at his desire, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, even if you decide to throw in the fiery furnace, our God will deliver us. Well, we know at the end of the day, at the end of time, that God will deliver us, his faithful children. And for anyone who has been impacted by this whole topic, whether they made irreversible life decisions, whether they were the ones perpetrating some of these decisions and actually doing these surgeries, if they ultimately fundamentally return to God and have faith in him and trust in him, then even those abuses and all those scars will be forgiven too. So I just want to leave people in this conversation with a message of hope for the future, no matter what the future brings.
Very good. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I can't really do any better than that. I do like Levi's talking, of course, has talked, I guess by the time this is released in the tour, about are being made in the image of God, and that keeping that in mind too, that you know, people will have suffered and have suffered damage as a result of this ideology, and the church should be a place where they are welcomed, right? Isaiah talks about eunuchs as inheriting the family of God, and the childless as rejoicing that God is giving them his descendants, his family, really, that whatever happens to us in this life, and whatever damage is done to our psyches and our bodies, God can heal those. He redeems us, right? And so, like Levi said, that gives us great hope. So thanks to you, Lucas, and Real Talk and Reform Perspective for chatting with us about this.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And yeah, thank you for your time today, gentlemen. It's been a surprisingly happy ending to a dark subject. So I'm pleasantly surprised. I think it went very well. Hopefully our listeners enjoyed it. Hopefully by the time you've heard this, you've been able to see ARPA on tour and have heard more in person. But hopefully you've learned from this, and that you'll get active in your community and reach out to your MP, reach out to your MLA, reach out to your MPP rather, and just be involved. Help hand out flyers, do everything you can to spread the word and help out our neighbors here in Canada. So with all that said, check out all of ARPA's work at arpacanada.ca, and you can find all their social handles there. For now, I think that's it for this time. So it's been Real Talk, and we'll catch you next time, folks.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Just a quick shout out to our sponsor for this episode, Redeemer University. You could check them out at redeemer.ca. Thanks to them for making this episode possible.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time.